I'm working really hard to focus my brain because that's what I'll do. I'll give my sermon disclaimers. Jan and everyone brought up this idea of ableism, and I want to remind us that the terms like that and language like that were not part of the Hebrew language or the culture at that time. Not that these issues didn't occur, they just did not have the language for it. So there may be words that are spoken today, especially depending on the translation. I think Eldon read that from the Inclusive Bible, which does a different job of saying certain things, because the Hebrew text for that passage does not say deaf and mute, it says dumb and deaf. That is not the language we would use today. It is not person first language, and I want to name that and honor that because it is still, however, the original language of the text. We have grown and matured, hopefully, not as much as we could, I guess, and navigated things to where we work to not be ableist, which, to expand a little bit on that definition, ableism is this idea that the able-bodied experience is the typical experience. It does not take into account what other people are doing. So it would be me, for example, if there was someone in a wheelchair and I said, well, why don't you just run over to the store? Why can't you just get up and run over there? That is ableist because I'm centering my able-bodiedness over the experience of someone else. And so I spend a lot of time these days telling people, well, that language is kind of ableist. Like everybody can't run to the store, or everyone can't, we talk about clearing stress. Everybody can't, well, just move your body. Everyone doesn't have the same ability to move their body in those ways. So being mindful of language and its evolution and how we talk about people is important. And I may say words today that would be deemed ableist, but it's in quotes, and I can do the Lego quotes if I need to, but it is coming directly from the text. I think that's all of my announcements. We'll see how it goes as I go through. Welcome to the second Sunday of Lent. We talked about it last week. It marks that 40-day period that Jesus spent in the wilderness leading to his death, burial, and resurrection. This year we're using Blessed is the Body, which I think I left in my backpack. I don't need it, but it is a book by Tatum Tricarico. Last week's theme was dust. We explored the limits of our certainty and how easily we mistake certainty for absolute truth, and how often systems, limiting beliefs, and our fears locate blame instead of offering care. Through Lazarus' story, we were reminded that God does not wait for certainty to act, but meets us in our fragility and calls us back into life, community, grace, and growth, and our breath. The focus this week, or through this last week, has been created. I struggled as the world turned, and I thought about created this week, and my heart was especially heavy. This week, we've watched as military action involving the United States, Israel, and Iran escalated tensions in the Middle East. In the days that followed, there were retaliatory strikes against the region, including in countries where U.S. military bases are located, where I still have friends. Many people are watching these events unfold with uncertainty, fear, and as the first casualties of United States service members occurred, grief. But those feelings are not isolated to those located far across the seas. Here in our own state, last week, in Congress, the legislature passed a bill overriding a veto by Governor Laura Kelly, where trans people and their markers were no longer honored. The number of texts I received with links and pictures of the letter that invalidated their licenses and birth certificates with no grace period, meaning they couldn't drive to work, couldn't get to doctor's appointments. Fines can be issued of $1,000 if someone reports a person using what they believe to be the wrong bathroom. My question became, how do you get a new license without a valid birth certificate? Because now their birth certificate markers are bad. How do you willfully now carry identification that is out of alignment with your identity and potentially the way that you express and who you know yourself to be? Those are the questions that I sat with as I received calls from impacted friends and parents of impacted folks as they try to figure out how to get them to work, how to get them to school. Do you just drive anyway? I had a 30-minute conversation with someone as we proed and con, just go. How do we do this? How do we build a Uber organization? How do we get rides? Like all of these things. How in this world where differences are being diminished and assimilation and compliance is considered civilized or normal, how do we survive? And better yet, how do we thrive? And the only answer that came up in my mind over and over and over again, it was two things. We do it together with a little help from our friends. I think somewhere in me is a white woman born in the 60s because them Beatles and Billy Joel be having me in a chokehold. I just love it. In Exodus, before we ever get to the burning bush, the text lingers over who Moses is. He's born under a death sentence, a Hebrew child targeted because of his people, and he survives because women refuse to let empire get the final say. He grows up in Pharaoh's house, shaped by the language and education of power, yet he's still different. He is still tethered to the suffering of his people. When he finally goes out to see them in chapter 2, the story gives us 3 scenes that quietly reveal Moses' character, rightly or wrongly, gifted and challenged. In one element, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and he intervenes, killing the Egyptian. Later, he sees 2 Hebrew men fighting, and he steps in again, this time asking, why do you fight? Why are you doing this? And their response is, what you gonna do, kill us like you killed that other guy? And he got scared and ran away. In Midian, he defends women at a well who are being harassed by the shepherds. These situations are not just narrative. They're designed to connect us to the plot of who Moses is before we find out what he has to do. These situations showed us a man who notices injustice and feels compelled to respond, even though there are times when his response has been imperfect, and that continues along. Moses is passionate and reactive. He is deeply aware of his stance between 2 worlds. He does have access to Pharaoh's privilege, yet he doesn't belong to it. He is kin to those that were enslaved, but he has not shared their daily reality. That tension followed him into exile in Midian. And by the end of chapter 2, he's built a life. He's got a wife. He becomes a dad. He names his son Gershom, which in the Hebrew translates to a stranger there. That tells us something about what Moses was feeling in that inner landscape. Long before God calls him, Moses understands what it means to feel out of place. In chapter 3, we encounter Moses tending to the flock of his father-in-law when he gets to Horeb, God's mountain. Not only does he come into contact with an angel of the Lord through a burning bush that does not seem to burn the bush, he hits the limits of his certainty, as I am sure we would too. Moses, again afraid, was called out of the bush, and God began to outline this master plan to bring the folks out of enslavement. Moses' reply in verse 11, and I feel very in tune with all of Moses' replies here, but his reply in verse 11 was, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt? God replies, I will be with you. That will be your sign that it is I who sent you. And when you have freed the people of Egypt, you shall worship God at this very mountain. And then he goes on and details provision. We're going to borrow this. We're going to take that. We'll have some silver and gold. It's the ultimate heist. Let's just get up and get out of there. I added that part. It's not Ocean's 11 and Moses. That was on me. The conversations continue to chapter 4, our focus today, and Moses is still asking questions. It's like, yeah, this is how we're going to do it. Here's some money. This is how we're going to handle it. And Moses is like, okay, but this time he says, what if they don't believe me? And what if they do not listen and say, the Lord did not appear to you? I can imagine God sighing and again offering some additional details. Moses is given the staff, the rod, and instructions on how to show forth the signs. God offers him everything within a shadow of a doubt. Well, that shadow of a doubt was not enough because Moses then still had more questions. This time he adds a plea. Please, O Lord. I have never been a man of words, either in times past or now, not ever, that you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And God again, without shame, without judgment. I think this is the part where I learn of God's long suffering. But he also doesn't give exhausting spiritual advice. Oh, stop thinking like that. If it were that easy, I would. Or just be confident. That's all you need. If you really trusted God, you wouldn't struggle. God didn't respond to Moses that way, even though sometimes we respond to each other that way. The first thing God says is not about Moses' potential or what he should do instead or how God is going to make it go away. God responds with his position, his authorship, his role as creator. To me, God responds sort of like, follow me, like Beyonce. And he almost says, you must not know about me. Like, it was me, exactly, you know, that song, like, you must not know who I am. Who gave speech to the mortals? Who made them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? That's a hard verse for some people because we have spent so much time trying to separate what is acceptable, unacceptable, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what is typical from what is diverse. But God don't move that way. Your life, your body, your capacity, none of that surprises her. Moses, in the truth and reality of who he was, is not an inconvenience to God's plan. And it wasn't something that God was not aware of when the plan was crafted. Moses is not a project. Moses is not a token. Moses is not only this limitation that he experiences. Moses is a person. One who, like us, has been created and called. Like each of us, the expert of his own lived experience. I know it's hard to remember that sometimes because people misuse scriptures to argue that they know best about other people's lives. What the Bible says about this or what the Bible says about that and what we pull from it as a means of control and added limitations. People reduce us to categories that flatten our existence. But in this text, when Moses says, I am slow of speech and slow of tongue, the text doesn't rush to diagnosis. It does not offer us an excuse or a reason. We don't get a label. We don't get an explanation. What we got is a person that can tell the truth about themselves in the face of what was probably a terrifying assignment. We don't have to force this situation into one category to recognize what it represents. Moses is naming that he does not move through the world the way people would expect a leader to move. He's naming a difference that he believes disqualifies him. He's been conditioned to believe that leaders are polished and certain, they're quick-witted, they speak smoothly, they don't tremble. And with that came the belief, whether we would name it for ourselves or not, that our humanity is only valuable when we can hide the parts that are inconvenient. But that's not what's here in the text. God does not revoke the call. God does not say, Moses, you know what, you're right, never mind. What he says in essence is, duh, I know, and you still going. I will be with your mouth and teach you what to say. Not I'm going to make you a different person. Not I'm going to heal you and remove this limitation. Not that I'm going to get someone else and you are like the wizard in the background pulling the strings like a puppeteer. He says, I am going to send you just as you are. But still, Moses is like, nah, B, not doing it. I remember when I felt like Moses, not quite with the burning bush. I think I'd have perished. I would have been with Jesus if I'd have saw that burning bush. But I remember when I first got the call to ministry and I felt it in my person. I too gave God a list of people that I felt were more qualified. I'll never forget the first name on the list. His name is Solomon Cogdale. And even now, I pray that he is on the path of his own purpose and not derailed by the voluntary service that I offered him up to. At the time, though, my reasoning felt responsible. In my mind, technically, it was not a refusal because I had offered a substitution. I offered an alternative. People who seemed more prepared, more articulate, more certain, skinnier, lighter, shorter, I don't know. But it was people who fit more easily into what I thought pastors were supposed to look like. What I did not know then that I know now was that my hesitation wasn't really about them. It was about me. It was about my belief that who I was, as I was, couldn't possibly be enough for what God was asking. I believe that's where Moses was too. Up to this point, he's told the truth about himself time and time again. And when God answers him with reassurance, we see that reassurance does not automatically dissolve doubts. Being called does not miraculously make somebody all of a sudden feel ready. Sometimes the call is what brings us face to face with our limitations, with our fears, with our doubts, and with all the reasons we disqualify our own selves before we even get started. I am struck by the fact that God does not remove the limitation, as often people think they do. And I'm sure the intention is good when people say, I will pray for your healing, or I will pray, for you to no longer be blind, or for you to be able to hear. I have heard prayers of people saying, I'll pray that your limb grows back, or whatever the case may be. God does none of that. What he does is he responds by making sure Moses will not be alone in the midst of his lived experience and what comes next. He calls in a little help. In comes Aaron. Here, Aaron is not a substitute. He is a partner and an accommodation. The call remains with Moses, but the burden is no longer his to carry by himself. God does not remove what Moses named as difficult. He adds and builds relationship around it. What Moses could not imagine as a strength becomes the place where community gets to enter the story. This is what I mean when I say community is an accommodation. From the very beginning, God's work has moved through relationship. And when I think about this past week and the calls and the conversations and the planning around this fear that people were holding, I'm reminded that what sustains us is rarely what gives us in isolation. It is people's presence. It is God's presence. It is knowing there is someone that when you dial that number will answer the phone. Someone who will sit with you while you figure out what comes next. Someone who will remind you that you are still who you've always been, even when systems or these bodies or doctors tell you otherwise. Moses didn't become less called because Aaron stood beside him. He became more fully supported. And maybe that's part of what it means to be created. Maybe that is what it means not only to be formed by God, but placed within a network of care where we don't have to disappear in order to belong, and where we don't have to pretend to be strong to be chosen. This may challenge what you think strength means, and that challenges the way we've been taught to think about strength. I was going to try to get away without saying something heretical, but here it goes because I can't get it out of my head. So I think about strength. Last night, while I was working on this, I was watching The Green Lantern. I had never seen The Green Lantern before because I'd be overwhelmed by all these heroes. But okay, oh, the story gets long. But I was at the comic book store on Saturday, and I was wrapping up my Black History Month collections and moving into my Women's History Month. So I've chosen Harley Quinn and Wonder Woman. I know it's a big difference. We can talk about it later, but it makes sense in my brain. And the guy was telling me about the Green Lantern because one of the Green Lanterns right now is a Black woman. And I was like, one of the Green Lanterns, how many Green Lanterns are there? And he was like, it's a core. And I was like, it says who? And so then I had to go watch the movie with Ryan Reynolds, which is interesting because he becomes Deadpool. But nevertheless, what I realized and what it has made me think about as I read comics and do all of that, it is so theology coded. Like all this Marvel universe, the DC universe, this hero stuff, these comic books, it is very theologically coded in Christian and religious beliefs. So the alien dies and he sends off the ring and it has to choose someone to become the next Green Lantern for this area. And it chooses Ryan Reynolds, who is irresponsible. He's reactive. He looks like he has a tender and good heart, but he's just a little bit all over the place. And ultimately, the hero story does what the hero story does. He finds strength in his will and he confronts and beats out fear. But he was not alone. And I'm like, maybe we all could be a little core of Green Lanterns. For me, the movie and the passage, let me focus on the Bible before you say I'm not preaching. For me, Exodus and Green Lantern shows me that community and accommodations and things that make life more accessible, whether it is a ladder or a lantern, is not a sign that something has gone wrong, or that someone has committed some grand moral failure. Community has always been part of the design. That is why I chose this title with a little help from my friends. The song begins with a question, which if you're hanging out with me is always going to be the case because I can't sing. But what would you do if I sang out of tune? It's not really about singing. It's about what happens when someone publicly reveals an imperfection. It asks what happens when someone can't meet the expectation that's been placed. Will you leave me behind or will you stay with me? The answer in the song is pretty simple. Nobody runs away when he sings out of tune, but he gets by with a little help from his friends. Beloveds, we are sustained by one another. There have been moments in your life, I'm sure, when someone helped you carry, or at least I hope there have been, where someone has helped you carry something you couldn't carry alone. There have been moments where presence has made the difference between continuing and giving up. Moses reminds us that it's not accidental. God did not expect him to become someone else. He made sure that in his self, he wouldn't have to do it alone. Accommodations are not a consolation prize. People should not have to work to have them. Accommodation is a part of the structure that makes it possible for people to live fully and experience society within the realms of who they were created to be. Community is how God responds to that vulnerability. It is how our dignity is protected when the world becomes harsh. It's how we move forward on the path when the road is uncertain. An accommodation is not evidence of weakness. Needing help is not evidence of weakness. They are both evidence of our wisdom. It is the recognition that access is not accidental. We have to work for it. And that dignity is preserved when we make room for one another to live, move, and have our being without having to hide, diminish, or explain who and how we are. It is a core tenet of our liberation. And I pray that you carry this truth with you through the rest of Lent and beyond. You were created by God, and you were also created in and for community. May you have the courage to receive the help that finds you and that may be sent to you, and the grace to offer that same help when others need it. And may you remember that none of us were ever meant to travel alone, and that the best way to get by, get through, get over, and get around is with a little help from your friends.